first of 3 presentations, and we're going to cover stress injuries. So I want to start right in on some of the consequences of stress injuries. Now, acknowledging that this mechanism of stress is not the only way that we end up with in a suicidal way. There is organic brain disease and other things. But as far as we're concerned, it has a massive role in this process. So anyway, as you can see here, you've probably read it, cops and firefighters were more likely to die by suicide in the line of duty. So in 2017, there's 103 deaths by suicide. All other causes of death, like suicide, cancer, heart disease, or not suicide, cancer, heart disease, and fireground, which are the other 3 of the top 4, added up to 93. One key thing here is the folks that are gathering these statistics, actually going through the data and polling departments trying to determine which deaths were by suicide, think that suicides are only reported about a rate of about 40%. So that's a fraction of the total. If we divide that 103 by 40%, we end up with 257 actual estimated suicides. Regardless of whether it's 257, still the data is really strong that suicide is the leading killer of firefighters and police officers. Compared to the general population, firefighters have a depression rate of 50% higher. Our rates of post-traumatic stress disorder are 2 to 3 times as high in the general population. And then once again, our suicide is at least 40% higher, if not much bigger than that. So all this data comes from, among other places, the Rutterman Foundation study in 2017, but a couple more numbers from there. If you look at those at the bottom, in 2015 and 2016, the number of suicides in the fire service were actually higher than in 2017. So food for thought. I think these statistics are valuable. I don't really feel like they're telling us anything that we might not know already, that there's a big psychological and health impact to the job that we're doing. So how do we start? How do we start changing that? Let's go to this. So you see there, it reads mental health interventions and suicide prevention. And then the caption in there is, damn, we lost another one. So as far as suicide prevention goes, it starts right here with you and I. So, and in the firehouse with each other. When we can start to speak in a more educated way and have more awareness about what's going on with us, just the processes and how our occupation and our work environment impacts us, and then be able to speak to that in a more matter-of-fact way, we're going to start changing the impact and the prevalence of stress injuries in the fire service. And then secondly, when we can be comfortable about the reality of it and speaking to each other about what's going on, that's the number one thing that we can do to decrease that stress reaction that we have in high stress situations and start to process what has happened with us. So connection with other human beings is the number one external variable in resilience. How well we are connected to others and our support systems does more to change how we get through life and the challenges of life than any other external variable. So I'm going to mention a lot the stress continuum model of health. In the next video, we'll be going over this model in depth, but because I mentioned it, I just wanted to give you all a look at it. If you've been in the stations and noticed the little 5x7 cards, I guess they are, that have this color-coded scale on it, you've probably seen it. You can pick it up and read it. It's basically a way to speak in a more granular way about the impact of chronic stress and acute stress without recovery on our systems, our health system, our biological system, our mental health, and our social health as well. So you can also think of kind of like a color-coded pain scale. All right, now we're on to stress injuries. So an injury is just the harm that occurs through an exposure to something. I would think of a stress injury as the harm that's caused by exposure to chronic and acute stress without recovery. And that without recovery is a key piece, because we're going to be exposed to these things But unless we take that time to recover from them and understand their impact of us, that's where the damage builds up, so to speak. So really also a stress injury is just, it's a new paradigm in as far as describing the impact of what we experience on the job. And they're common. So they're common and predictable. We see these things repeated over and over again. Matter of fact, a lot of the language that is in those stress continuum cards is coming right from firefighters at South Metro, even other in the Denver area. So they're common and they're predictable exposure patterns to the things we experience on the job. And so because they're predictable, just like back in the day when in the fire service, we didn't wear SCBAs, it became predictable that lung damage would ensue and other diseases would come from inhaling those toxic products of combustion. We can mitigate those things through protective steps because we know they're out there and they're predictable. A key part here, you'll see once again, is that they're physical as well as psychological injuries, and then they can be supported as such. So just as we can rehab from a physical injury, we can rehab and support a psychological injury. And importantly, one thing that I would like folks to take away from this is that our health systems, I see it as three components. We have our physical health, our mental health, and our social health. All those three things are a system and they're intertwined and they all impact each other both for the better and the worse. And then finally here, this is something that hangs up people about like reporting or saying that they're suffering psychologically or they're not doing well or whatever thing that we can get stuck in. These psychological injuries, but also the entirety of stress injuries are reversible and they're treated when recognized. So this big point of this whole program, these first two slide series, both on stress injuries and then using that continuum, is recognizing what's happening to us and what's changing our behavior or how we're feeling for what it is, and then engaging with it so that we can reverse it, so we can treat it. Okay, so in that 4-color continuum, that is describing also these stress injuries. They occur on a continuum. And then when we get into it, you'll see that once we're in the red, that's where we may be experiencing actual signs of post-traumatic stress. As we build up this load of chronic stress or we suffer some acute stress, we're gonna feel that impact, and it might impact our sleep, our mood, like our attitude at work, our willingness to engage, and whatnot. So they have early and late changing vital signs. Once again, we might, because if we're chronically stressed, we might be a little more agitated than we were, or we might be struggling to have a good perspective on things. And then as that moves down, maybe that we're angry and we're overreacting to a lot of things that we normally or that we wouldn't when we were in a situation where we were more rested and that we'd recovered from a chronic stressor or an acute stress. So they're also dynamic. So they change, our reactions to events change, and they can change for the better or the worse. Important here is that if we're in a state where we're chronically stressed, maybe that we've run a tough couple of calls or just one, something in our home life is not going so well for us, we're depleted. We have less resources. Maybe we're sleeping less, our fitness isn't as good and whatnot. We're more likely to become injured if we pile on even more stress or we suffer another acute event of stress. So if you're already stressed out, things aren't going well at home, maybe you're even struggling at work or both, and then you run a really gnarly call, you're more likely to suffer or feel a much bigger impact of that call than if things were otherwise. If you had a really good home, things were going great at home, so to speak, work, maybe you had a really good crew, you were feeling well rested, you're less likely in that state to really feel the impacts of a particularly maybe upsetting call, so to speak. So there's a lot of physiology goes into it of how the outside world and what we experience and also our perception of the inside world gets into our body and starts to harm us physiologically. But the long story short is it's all about the chemicals that are secreted in our body when our body is perceiving stress. So the baseline is that the two big ones to think about as far as stress chemicals are cortisol and then epi. So when we're under chronic stress, our body is going to be sensing that, and it is going to be secreting elevated levels of cortisol. So this is a chemical that is going to prepare our body for maybe the long winter. The upshot of it is that in the short-term or acute stress environment, cortisol does a lot of good things to prepare us to respond and get our body more robust to handle an injury or whatnot. And then epi, of course, in those short-term acute environments, brings to bear a lot of physiological changes which allow us to respond more effectively in the moment. The problem is that when we get into the medium and the long-term environment, when those two things are elevated, then we're no longer recovering, we're not resting. And this will get important. So our immune system is actually is going to be depressed over the medium and long term with cortisol. Our sleep is going to be disruptive. What we crave is going to be disruptive. So if you can think about it, we make our gains in athletic training, or even when we're studying something academically, so cognitively, when we're resting and recovering. So we train, we work out physically, and then we stop that, we nourish our bodies, and then we get rest. And that's the time when our body rebuilds. So if we're always preparing or responding to things, our bodies never get a chance to rest. So we never get this recovery signal if we're have this, our cortisol levels are always up and our epi is spiking frequently. Our body never gets that recovery signal, so it doesn't do it. So the physical impacts of stress injuries are here on this slide. When we are feeling a lot of pressure from stress, whether it's external stressors or our perceptions of internal stressors, so it doesn't matter if they're physical or psychological, internal or external, when we're feeling a lot of that, our body's going to have a reaction to that. That's involuntary. The result of that chronic elevated cortisol and the epi are all the things that you see here. Pick your spot where you want to start. I would say sleep disruption is one of the most common things I hear about as peer support, but even in talking to people as firefighters, and that is something that has effects throughout the whole of our psychological and physical health as well. So not only are we just resting physically in there, but we're also literally at that time when we're asleep, our brain is getting cleansed of the metabolites that have built up during our active and awake cycles during the day. But also when we're in rapid eye movement, we're in that dream state. That's where the events of our day are actually being integrated into the new self. So we're processing those things, we're filing them away, we're putting them in perspective in relationship to other things. And so if we're not sleeping, we can't do those vital processes that allow the brain to recuperate and then to take our memories and what has happened to us to integrate into us so that they become something that happened to us in the past instead of something that we're continually reacting to in the future. And if you've ever been sleep deprived for a while, you will know that it is really hard to think clearly. And so we're not going to perform as well. We're going to struggle to learn. We're going to struggle to pay attention. And then those things, if we're in a challenging environment, let's say you're studying for a promotional exam, or maybe you're a paramedic in your FI process and you're under a lot of rigor where you're trying to work, that degradation of your abilities is just going to add to your stress level in there. Another thing that happens when we have that chronic elevated cortisol, we're more predisposed to cancer and diabetes and increased inflammation. And a lot of that mechanism is you'll see people as they get older in their careers, they have this middle-age drift. So this over here in that top left of the screen is that central adiposity. And so we know that belly fat, it's not helpful to carry around extra weight, but there's a lot of mediators that impact inflammation in our body and impact the mediators of cancer in our body with that central adiposity. So all of these things are tied together. Now, we know that increased inflammation in the body is one of the mechanisms of injury also for cardiac injuries. And then as you can see, we have higher blood pressure or higher lipidemia, we have higher blood pressure. Those things don't help with cardiac injuries. And then the diabetes comes from the fact that when we're at chronically elevated levels of cortisol, it actually changes our cravings for what we want to eat. So that cortisol is helping the body prepare for long-term stressors, and so it's driving and increasing cravings of sweet foods and salty foods and fatty foods, because it's just trying to amass as many calories as possible, somewhat akin to maybe a bear putting on a ton of weight in order to hibernate. Generally, we're not going to hibernate. I know some people spend a lot more time in the lazy boys than not, but they're not hibernating. Anyway, we don't hibernate. We don't have a good reason to be putting on a ton of excess body fat and weight. So I think I've touched on all of those. One thing that is prevalent also with chronic levels of cortisol is this thing down here in the bottom right of the screen, which is a pathological fracture. And that is a fracture that happens with a minimal amount of force. So the amount of force that normally wouldn't harm your bone, a bone will fracture it. And how that's happening is, once again, cortisol is getting the body prepared to fight or struggle and not rest. And so calcium is not being sequestered in our bones. And then finally, that's kind of leads to the fact that when our levels of cortisol are higher, it's also not only affecting our bones, but our connective tissue. And so there's some good research out there that's pointing that these high levels of cortisol are also contributing to a lot of these physical orthopedic injuries that were happening. So food for thought. It's certainly mostly older guys that are down in wellness right now getting fixed. And I think the research is pretty good that at least one contributor to those maladies that those people are dealing with is this chronic cortisol from stress reactions. All right, so how do these stressors get into our body? We're just going to go over some brief nervous system stuff. As you can see, this is a pencil drawing that I've done because I just want something really basic. And there's three parts of the nervous system that we're going to be discussing, and why it's helpful to differentiate between the three parts is that knowledge begins to give us some insight into, like, one, what is happening in the process, so we can have more awareness of what's going on. And then when we label things, oftentimes we have a lot more power to manipulate them and change them to our benefit. So we want to understand that. Secondly, when we understand how these different three parts of the nervous system relate to each other, that's going to lead us down the path for some tactics, that we can use to address our level of arousal in the moment. So if we're over aroused, we're activated, this gives us some cues of how we can decrease our levels of arousement, or on the other way, if we need to get up and be more alert, this is going to give us some cues and for some tactics of how to use it. All right, so our thinking brain. That is the part of you that you are associating with yourself. It defines you as me. It's driving all our voluntary and conscious responses to our experiences. So those are our thoughts. It communicates with language, thoughts, and concepts. Our thinking brains are also in charge of explicit learning. So when we're studying for an exam or learning this new material, that is our thinking brain driving conscious attention to what we're focused on. The protection strategy that the thinking brain uses is to anticipate what's going to happen, plan for things that are going to happen, think about plans and strategies, and then make decisions on that. Importantly, this is going to get into like patterns of thought in the future. All right, moving down the chain here, we get to our survival brain. So that's everything that's not our cortex and it's not our autonomic nervous system, although it is part of it. It's in charge of of involuntary and unconscious responses to our experiences. So everything that we can't control with consciousness. It communicates to the rest of the nervous system and to the thinking brain via emotions and physical responses. So these are gut reactions, or that's a feeling in your chest you get from an outside stressor. That's the survival brain reacting and communicating in that way. In conversely to explicit learning, which is focused attention, its mechanism of learning is implicit, which is just constant scanning in the environment. So constant unconscious attention to what's going on. Another thing that it does is this concept of neuroception, which is it's rapidly scanning our internal and external environment for basically two things that are opportunities and things that are threats. So it's looking for opportunities either for more comfort or more safety or more warmth, or things that feel good, and also things that are threatening, or cause pain like that. So it's always looking and judging these two things without a ton of discernment because it can't bring that conscious level of thought to it. So that's neuroception. It's always scanning internally and externally. Its protection strategy, so to speak, is to move towards those things that are safe and pleasurable and move away from things that are unpleasant and dangerous. And so at any time when we are highly activated, we've gone into that fear, flight mode, this is the survival brain that's driving. And some of those physiological responses that we can notice that have another purpose are like that narrowing of the field of view, the increase of the heart rate, the more shallow and rapid breathing that we have, muscle tension, tingling in the muscles. That's the survival brain driving in these high threat situations. Where there's opportunity for growth and where we can learn to be resilient or perform better in high stress situations is to recognize that what's going on, and through using different techniques that are more than just thinking techniques, decrease our state of arousal so that we can bring our thinking brain back online. And the final part for our sake of this nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. So that's the parasympathetic, which is kind of the rest and relax or calming down, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is going to increase our activation. But a couple important points is that it's two-way communication. So just as our brains can send signals down through our nervous system, we're also getting signals back to our brain. And this is key because just for example, some of our thoughts are involuntary. Like if we close our eyes, there'll just be a flood of thoughts coming into us. But then also some of our thinking can be voluntary. We can consciously focus on something or follow a logical train of thought. But what we can do is, because we can control some of this stimulation that's coming from our nervous system both ways, that's how we can bring our thinking brain back online in states of really high stress arousal. Some key points here as far as the nervous system is that it is a system. So it functions optimally when the autonomic nervous system, that survival brain, and the thinking brain are working in concert. So that means that when those three systems are communicating between the components with accurate communication, so meaning that when you get a stimulus through your survival brain, then it's actually interpreted correctly from your thinking brain. Or sometimes what happens in the process of stress injuries or even stress disorder is that survival brain is not properly interpreting what's going on in that process of neuroception. So it's going way over into high activation states or having false alarms to seemingly innocuous stimuli. And then importantly though, why it's key to keep in mind that these are a system is one of the really common tactics that I hear or people say in response to something that's stressful is like, oh, I just compartmentalized it. I didn't think about it. So compartmentalizing is a form of avoidance, and it's definitely a legitimate and helpful short-term tool, and only in the short term. When we just cannot avoid and then compartmentalize these things because we function as systems. We're not machines or in computers where something that's off in the corner or doesn't impact us. All of these experiences do. So that is to say that if our thinking brain is, if you're in the habit of not responding to the signals from your survival brain that it's feeling threatened or sensing threat, it's only going to trigger greater responses on down the road. So that's why avoidance isn't a medium or a long-term strategy. It's only helpful at times in the short term. When we're experiencing stress, whether it's acute or chronic, that's changing how that survival brain is perceiving the world, and it can be more sensitized if we're not responding to it and acting in accordance with how we can best cope and rest. So that's acknowledging what's going on and what's stressing, like taking the steps to reduce those stressors where we can, rest and recover where we can as well.